So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashleigh Smith. I am a senior studying art history with a concentration in museum theory and practice. And today I'm going to share with you a bit of information about my exhibition, Dreams of Defiance, Black Feminist Fantasy, and the Direct Gaze. So in today's presentation, I'm going to start with the exhibition theme, talk about its logistics, go through the project's timeline, deal with some key terms, and then we'll finish off with a digital tour of the exhibition. So, Dreams of Defiance is a selection of works, many of them from the Nasher's collection, that examines the role of gaze in Black female portraiture. Defined as a steady and intent look, gaze within the context of art history often refers to the power dynamics at play when the male artist is cast as the active protagonist and the female body as his passive subject. You'll see here one of the object combinations from the exhibition that highlights a traditional approach to gaze, exemplified by Pablo Picasso's Le Peintre et son modèle, or the painter and his model, and a contemporary critique of gaze, exemplified by this work by Carrie Mae Weems in the lower right, which is a selection from her series Not Monet's Type. On the left, we see the painter's profile, his eyes focused and attentive to his model. His model leans her head back, pushing her torso forward. While the painter's body is shrouded by gesture lines, the model's nude body is fairly clear for the viewer. So too are her breasts and rear. Though Picasso was known for fragmenting and contorting the human form, I believe this is a deliberate choice made to contort her body for the purpose of highlighting the hypersexual nature of the model, a theme in which Carrie Mae Weems addresses directly in the image on the lower right. Just beneath the photograph, as part of the caption, it reads, "Picasso, who had a way with women, only used me." Weems's me stands as a collective pronoun for female bodies. This is a direct example of not only the power of gaze, but the way that contemporary artists actively critique earlier works from art history. So, featuring the works of contemporary artists such as LaToya Ruby Frazier, Zanel Mohole, and Carrie Mae Weems, this online exhibition highlights the works in which the power of the gaze is wielded by the Black female subject. Challenging past portraiture that objectified female bodies through submissive poses and positions, the direct gaze beheld in these assertive self-portraits visually confronts the viewer as an intentional act of defiance. These images bring to light the historical erasure of Black women from our shared visual culture. Self-portraits by Black women artists are juxtaposed with earlier works by artists such as Edgar Degas, as you see on the left, and Pablo Picasso on the right, as well as contemporary representations of Black women by artists such as Andy Warhol. This exhibition seeks to track the cultural, political, and artistic currents that influence Black women's self-representations. The desire to move Black women artists from the margins to the center of art historical study is a Black feminist approach. By analyzing these works through the scholarship of Patricia Hill Collins, Dr. Marcia Muskimen, and Dr. Lisa Gale Collins, this installation seeks to demonstrate how Black feminism can create critical and original art historical narratives. So, getting into some of the logistics of the exhibition, Dreams of Defiance is an online exhibition through the Nasher Museum of Art's official website. And it was actually intended for the academic focus gallery in the Nasher itself. But due to COVID-19, we have worked really hard over the past 2 weeks to reconfigure the materials for an online platform. So I'm excited to share that with you all later. Secondly, this project has actually been a year-long project that's been facilitated through my internship at the Nasher Museum of Art, where I've worked in the curatorial department. And through curatorial, I've worked under both Trevor Schoonmaker, who has now been named the new director of the Nasher, as well as Dr. Ellen Raymond, who's the assistant of academic initiatives there. And the internship is actually part of my museum theory coursework. So I've worked there for 2 semesters and taken internship classes in relation to the internship. And then lastly, this project is actually an extension of my senior honors thesis, which is entitled A Self-Defined Sex Being, Self-Portraiture as Black Feminist Fantasy for the Purpose of Liberation. And when bringing the thesis into the conversation, this has actually been a 2-year-long project that I'll get into the timeline with you now. So, looking at a big picture timeline of the project, we start in the fall of 2018 when I decided to participate in a domestic study away program called Duke in New York. And while in New York, I took a full semester of Duke courses and also interned at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in the curatorial department. Which was an amazing experience. And while there, I got the opportunity to do some research on an upcoming exhibition on the sculptor Simone Lee, who you'll see the actual installation of her Guggenheim show here on the upper right. Um, and what was so amazing about Simone Lee is that her practice really focuses on Black female subjects, and her works to cater to Black women as a primary audience, which I thought was such an interesting shift in the way I learned about art history and the work of artists. So that was a really important part of this project, was getting the chance to kind of research and learn the literature related to Simone Lee's work. And then also while in New York, I got the chance to see the exhibition Posing Modernity, the model from Monet to Matisse to today, which is curated by Denise Murrell, who's now a curator at the Met, but was then a postdoc fellow at Columbia. And Posing Modernity looks at Black female portraiture from 18th and 19th century France all the way to contemporary art. And so getting the opportunity to research Simone Lee and interact with this exhibition really opened my eyes to the way that the Black female figure has yet to fully be studied within the context of Western art, and to also understand her cultural significance, both in the art world and beyond. So that following semester, when I came back to Duke, I took Dr. Jasmine Cobb's Black Camera class and began further exploring my questions about the Black female figure, this time with specific relations to sexuality and to personal agency. And I did so by analyzing 3 works by the artist Renee Cox, who you see pictured here. And that paper would actually serve as the beginning of my senior honors thesis research experience. Then that following summer, I took part in a 9-week summer research program at the University of Chicago through my fellowship. And I'm actually a Mellon Mays Fellow. So as a Mellon Mays Fellow, I conduct independent research throughout the semester under the supervision of my amazing mentor, Dr. Cobb. And through my New York experience, it became clear to me that this was the question that I really wanted to grapple with a little bit more significantly, and I deemed it my official Mellon project. And so through Mellon's funding and research support, I was able to take part in this 9-week summer research program at the University of Chicago, which is one of the things that Mellon does to kind of enrich its scholars. And there are summer research programs all over the world, in Cape Town, UCLA, and then of course at UChicago. So while I was at UChicago, I was challenged to develop a clear question, a definitive argument, and ultimately ended up creating a 30-page paper proposal that included a background, literature review, as well as early drafts of the introduction and first chapter of my senior thesis. So while developing the paper proposal, I formed this question. Given that our history has often been used to further promote stereotypes of Black women and their sexuality, what strategies do Black women artists use to work against these stereotypes? In pursuing the answer, it became clear to me that an exhibition would serve as a pivotal part of highlighting both the problem that I saw in art history, as well as the solutions that I believe artists like Renee Cox were implementing. So at this point in the timeline, it's August of 2019, and I've established the thesis idea, the concept, and all of that. So entitled A Self-Defined Sex Being, Self-Portraiture as Black Feminist Fantasy for the Purpose of Liberation, my thesis examines the following: how the Black female figure has been represented in the canon, specifically the linkages between her figure and narratives of bodily exploitation as it relates to sex and labor during slavery and colonization, the way these representations take away Black women's agency over their own depictions and by extension their own bodies, the way self-portraiture, both in practice and presentation, allow Black women to reclaim their bodies and their narratives, the way this process aligns with what Black feminist scholar Patricia Hill Collins defines as self-definition, how specifically artists Carrie Mae Weems and Renee Cox represent this through their works, and lastly, how an exhibition would further contribute to not only the public impact of artists like Renee Cox and Carrie Mae Weems' work, but the overall narrative that I've been trying to tell through this research. So moving forward, it's now the fall of 2019, and I've begun my Nasher internship, and I'm given the opportunity to curate the academic focus gallery based on my thesis research. And given that creating an exhibition was actually a part of the thesis argument that I had been thinking about, I was really excited at the opportunity to curate it. The thing that was important to me, though, the exhibition that I was proposing in the thesis really dealt with works by Renee Cox and Kara Mae Weems specifically. And though the Nasher does have a Kara Mae Weems in its collection, it doesn't have all of the specific works that I was thinking about for the exhibition. So what I decided to do was kind of shift the focus of the exhibition, but hold on to the main ideas that were important in the thesis. So I decided to pursue Dreams of Defiance. In the fall, while doing collection research, I was noticing a trend among Black women's portraiture, and specifically the gaze. In many of the portraits, Black women's gaze seemed to be a pivotal aspect of not only the work's composition, but the overall narrative that the work was trying to tell. And given my thesis research, I knew how defiant this was in the context of art history, and thus Dreams of Defiance was created. In the fall, my main focus was on collection research and artist research. And then in the spring, I began working on wall labels, a curatorial statement, and a presentation for the College Art Association conference in Chicago, which you see pictured here. And I had the opportunity to kind of present my thesis research as well as the way that the exhibition fit into the overall thesis research. We then forward to March of 2020 and COVID-19. And just before we left for spring break, I was working on the exhibition's layout with some people at the Nasher. And then over the course of spring break, as we know, things changed. And my supervisor at the Nasher proposed this idea for doing the exhibition digitally. And it's been challenging to kind of convert everything in such a short period of time. But what I'm so thankful for about the process is that it's allowed me to give greater context to the exhibition that I wouldn't have been able to give just through the traditional the traditional in-person gallery. So I've been able to add some multimedia components such as a podcast, a playlist, some loans, you would say, of works that are in other museums that kind of speak to the topic, as well as a list of academic resources for people to look into. So at this point in the timeline, it's now April of 2020, and the exhibition Dreams of Defiance, Black Feminist Fantasy, and the Direct Gaze examines the following: Black women's self-portraiture from the Nasher's collection, gaze as a tool of Black feminist defiance, defiance as a means of self-definition, historical representations of female figuration to highlight the art historical references that contemporary artists are commenting against, and lastly, contemporary renderings of the Black female figure and political posters to highlight the cultural significance and political power of these images. So, though the paper and the exhibition are two different projects, they're directly linked by their examination of self-portraiture, self-definition, and Black feminist fantasy. Self-portraiture was especially significant because I noticed the way that art historical examples of Black female portraiture included stereotypical references. To me, this insinuates that the sitter had little agency when it came to her own depictions. I see self-portraiture as a literal and metaphorically powerful approach to reclaiming one's narrative. The importance of reclaiming one's narrative is a reason why I see self-definition is so essential. There's a cultural idea of who Black women are, and it's steeped in a history of stereotype. By creating their self-portraits, Black women artists are able to define themselves as individuals rather than be defined by history and stereotype. This idea of defining oneself for oneself, separate from the pervasive influence of stereotype, is the Black feminist fantasy to which I refer in both the exhibition and the paper. It's a fantasy because our realities are still so deeply connected to such histories, but I argue that the creation and display of Black women's self-portraiture has the ability to help people break away from stereotype, create new understandings of Black women, and thus transition these representations of free and self-defined Black women as from images of fantasy to images of reality, tangible reality. So without further ado, I'm going to lead us to the digital exhibition and walk you through that. So we'll start with the header, which is the Latoya Ruby Frazier image that I showed you in the paragraph. And I think both Latoya, who's staged as a young girl on the right, and her grandmother's stare is strikingly direct. And to me, speaks to the way that self-portraits let the viewer into the artist's world and inner perspective, unlike any other genre. From there, we move into a bit of background that I mentioned to you all about the exhibition. Um, a steady and intent look is the curatorial statement for the exhibition that I actually have been walking you all through throughout the course of the PowerPoint, but if you want to see it written, it's all here. And then throughout the webpage, you'll find a set of artworks that are emphasized and have their own text that kind of speak to the way the given artist is using self-portraiture and gaze as a tool of self-definition. So we see here a section on Sonoma Hole. And just beneath this, there's also one on Genevieve Vanguard. But before that, I really want to talk about the traditional representation section, which is something that I got to add as a result of it being a digital exhibition. Both of these works are actually in France. The first one is at the Louvre and the second at the Montpellier. And what's so exciting about including these works is that these are, not only are these examples of Black women's portraiture that are fairly prevalent in the literature, they're specific examples of the way that art history has dealt with the Black female subject, using the examples from the Nasher's collection, the Degas and the Picasso that I mentioned, definitely gets to the topic, especially with the Carrie Mae Weems comparison I showed you. But I felt like it was important to give examples of Black women's portraiture specifically within the canon, to kind of show you the artworks and the ideas that these contemporary Black women artists are aware of and actively critiquing in their work. So that was one of the exciting comparisons for me. And then as we move down, there's also the object and spectator comparison, which is the one that I showed you earlier in the PowerPoint. And I think what's so poignant about this example is that it shows the way the contemporary artists are often looking backwards, but looking backwards with the goal of self-definition specifically that I had been talking about previously. There's also a section on double consciousness as it relates to Carrie Mae Weems's work. And then the last kind of emphasized image is of this political poster by the Guerrilla Girls, and which is a anonymous collective of feminist artists. And what I thought was so important about including this one is that I think some of these images, if isolated, could kind of be seen as just individual expressions of creativity. But I think when grouped together and then paired with a political poster, we see that these images are kind of speaking to a shared history, and have political implications beyond the frame when it comes to the art world, the art market, and the way that we remember history. So those are the emphasized works. And then below you'll see a gallery with the rest of the works that I originally chose for the exhibition. And then there's some multimedia aspects such as the podcast here, which talks a bit about my experience taking classes at the Nasher over the past 4 years, working with the Nasher over the past 4 years, and then a bit of personal background when it comes to how I came up with the idea for the exhibition. There's a playlist, and I have to shout out Andre Mego, who's here. I saw him at the beginning, who helped work on this playlist with me. The playlist really tries to speak to the themes of the exhibition when it comes to self-definition and Black women's beauty. And I think we did a really great job with it. I love the first song, which is a poem actually by Raina Biddy that everyone should listen to. But that's the playlist. And then it ends with a list of academic articles. And I felt like it was important to include the articles because I wanted people to see the research that goes into a project like this, as well as give them an opportunity to continue learning. Because I think there is literature and there are people asking questions about Black women's portraiture and representations, but it's not a part of like mainstream thoughts about art history per se. And so I wanted to provide those sources for people if they wanted to delve deeper. So that is the digital exhibition. This project has been so important to me. And as I've been developing, these intellectual questions, it's kind of been mirrored by my own questions as to how was liberation going to play a role in the way that I lived my life? What role was history going to play in the way that I saw myself? And ultimately, how did I want to go about self-definition as a young self? So it's been a journey, both professionally and personally. And I'm just grateful that you all came to hear a little bit about it. That's the exhibition. Thank you.
So we'll open the floor up to some questions. Personally, I'd like to hear a little bit about how you got started in art. and
Mhm.
why you came to Duke for art and why you're studying art, and like what role does it play in your life?
Yeah, sure. So I actually did not intend on studying art history when I got to Duke. I was going to do public policy and human rights, and I had the whole thing planned out. But I took an AP art history course my senior year of high school, and it was the first class I had taken um, up until that point that I was coming after school to ask more questions. I wanted to know more. And when I got to college, Miss Gwen actually at the Mary Lou encouraged me to kind of pursue that. If that's something that is so interesting to me, why not take a few electives and kind of see where I wanted to go with it? Um, and I fell in love with it. I was reading art history books for fun and not just for class. And I felt like that was an indicator that this is something that I should take seriously. And so ever since then, I've really pursued art history and museum work really heavily. And it's informed, everything that I do. I love the fact that this project, though it's an academic project, has allowed me to explore personal questions as it relates to representation and Black feminism. And I think that's what's so amazing about art to me, is that it reflects my personal experiences and allows me to not only think about what's happening with an object or in a work, but how does it reflect the greater world and history and context that we're in. So,
I have a question.
sure.
It has to do with your start with your interest in art history, like kind of related. But
Mhm.
seeing your background, your experience, and I'm a rising junior, by the way, so
Mhm.
I'm very late in the game of like being interested in art history. And
Yeah.
how that came about was I'm an Italian major, which is also kind of recent too.
Okay.
And I realized that like a lot of the things I'm interested in Italian is its history with art.
Mm.
So I've been thinking about my senior project, of course, and I'm like realizing that it has to do a lot with art history and
Mhm.
something about minoring in it. But do you have any like advice for someone who wants to like kind of catch up in the game but don't want to like overload themselves just so to get
Yeah.
myself more involved in art history?
Yeah, for sure. I think um, as much as my art historical education has been informed by the classes I've taken, there's a lot of things that I've done independently to kind of bolster my art historical knowledge. I follow a lot of my social media is art and art history related. So different Instagram accounts, you know, following ArtNet, following different art news sources to kind of be up to date with what's going on in the art world. I actually took an iTunes U class on modern art history. Those are free and you read them at your own pace and can kind of it's I think it's through art story perhaps, but the lesson plans are structured kind of like my high school art history class, like, unit 1, unit 2, different artists, different time periods. And so I think kind of looking for some of those outside resources can be really helpful, especially now when we have a little bit more free time and you can go at your own pace. um, if you want to talk with me separately, I can give you like the actual links and different things like that. But all of that is to say that there's lots of resources outside of just taking classes and overloading, though I do recommend taking classes for sure. But if your schedule just doesn't permit it, there are all sorts of resources that you can use to learn a bit more. So if you want to message me afterwards, I can give you some links
Thank
for sure.
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question. Um, can you tell us about some of your most memorable art history experiences at Duke?
Sure. Yeah. Um, One of my most memorable. I think one of my most memorable was I came to visit Duke when I was a senior, and the Nasher was one of the places that I wanted to make sure that I visited during my time. And I came by myself, was at Duke by myself. And I don't know what the name of the exhibition was because it was a while ago, but it seemed to be comprised mainly of kind of contemporary African American art. And I remember actually kind of like being brought to tears when I left because I had been kind of a teen in the Teen Arts Council at the St. Louis Art Museum, and so I'd engaged with art museums significantly, but had never been to an exhibition at that point that was fully dedicated to kind of that subject matter. I had been to like an artist-specific show for Carrie James Marshall, but never something that was thematic and a little bit more expansive. And I remember thinking like, I have to be a part of that. And then when I came in the fall, the first show was Southern Accent, and I thought Southern Accent was amazing. And so I think having that first show be the way I was kind of introduced to the Nasher as a high schooler was really impactful for me, because it was the thing that made me know I wanted to get involved with the Nasher. And then having visited a few university museums around the country now, I see just how rare the Nasher's approach really is. There are a lot of museums that are sticking to traditional art history, sticking to the canon, and I think the creators of the Nasher have done a really amazing job diversifying the collection and making sure to expose students to a wide array of exhibitions. We had Native Voices earlier, Pop America. Like, we've had so many amazing shows that students have gotten to engage with and have that be kind of like their entree into art history. And so I think that's been the thing I'll probably take with me after I leave, is that there are ways to really mix up the way we do shows and how we collect, and really represent the people that museums are meant to represent.
We have a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay,
The first one is pretty long, so I'll let you read that. But the second one, they're curious if your research included Spartman and her story as it relates to eroticism, fetishization of Black women.
Oh, Saartjie Baartman?
Yes.
I'll start with that question, then I'll get to Professor Jassek's question. So I did. In my thesis paper, I actually use a lithograph by Leon de Wiley of Saartjie Baartman as one of my art historical examples. I actually use that and Delacroix's Espace, which is in the traditional representation section, to kind of speak to the way that the stereotypes are kind of solidified in art history. So I definitely did. And I actually had a really interesting conversation with Professor Stiles about, the level of dehumanization that Saartjie Baartman experienced. Is it hypersexualization? Is it eroticism? Because in that question, there's still somewhat of a assumption of one's humanity, and she feels like the way that Saartjie Baartman was exhibited was so dehumanizing that does eroticism and exoticism really fit what happened to her, which I thought was a really interesting conversation that we had. So that's all to say, I definitely did look at Saartjie Baartman's depictions, and Deb Willis has an anthology called Black Venus 2010 that has a lot of essays that talk about different angles on representations of Saartjie Baartman. So definitely read that and enjoyed that. And then Professor Jassek's question is, might compare to African-American men in their self-portraits.
Sorry, it's so long.
No, it's okay. It's okay. What's particularly feminist about the camera, do you think? It's an interesting question. I think that the feminist point for me might not necessarily be the camera, but the approach. I think it's just so happened that the medium has been prevalently photography for the conversation that I'm having. But I think about self-portraits and images by like Faith Ringgold and Emma Amos, who I think still very much speak to what I'm trying to get at when it comes to self-definition. I think the intention is to represent oneself, and that's kind of like the feminist angle to it, is being able to tell your own story, to not solely be submissive the way one's expected to be. But I definitely think that your point about Black men's representation, the Black men's self-portraits, are really interesting and something I hadn't thought about before. But they too experience hypersexualization, similarly, but somewhat differently also, given just the nature of how stereotypes differ in relation to gender. But I hadn't thought about that before. I think I definitely will think on that more as it relates to Black men's self-portraiture, for sure.
Hi, Ashleigh. Thank you so much for this presentation of your work. It's so inspiring, and it's inspiring to see you kind of evolve as an artist. So my question So one, this is really exciting for me because so my senior thesis in sociology was kind of about reality television and images of Black womanhood in that. And so this kind of makes me think about something modern. And with your focus on self-portraitures, how do you incorporate the role of Instagram in our modern social media kind of space in being a part of this work of this Black feminist fantasy and kind of defying and redirecting gaze. And especially when maybe right now, I think we all kind of engage with it so normally that it's in our everyday life, like whether it's your Instagram posts or your stories, but how you could see this being documentary art in the future when we look back and say, how have people utilized Instagram and social media as a way of self-expression and self-portrait creation?
It definitely plays a role, and I think is an example of the way that Black women's self-portraiture, its influence kind of like proliferates, because I think what I'm trying to say in the thesis is that seeing these images influences the way that Black women see themselves, and as a result, the way that society makes room for Black women to show up. And I think that it happens on a bit of an even more macro scale in something like Instagram. Easy is it for you to see a photo or a selfie that someone took, and not only do you like it, but then you gassed her up and told her how great she looked, and then it inspired you to take your own picture later today because, you know, she looks so good and you think you look so good. And I think it kind of speaks to the idea that I was saying about how these images have tangible social and political consequences or effects, but on an even greater scale. Because I think these self-portraits have a very specific influence by being exhibited in fine arts spaces and things like that. And that is a very specific demographic of people who enter those spaces and things. But for it to be as democratized as on something like Instagram, the influence is able to permeate all sorts of communities in all sorts of ways. So I think it's especially important, and we see how kind of like social media self-representation influences fine artists, even with Ebony Patterson, whose show was at the Nasher currently, and the way that some of her images were originally influenced by social media posts. So I think it just kind of speaks to the power of social media images.
I have a question about your next step. So you're graduating, you're a senior. What's next on the horizon for you?
Yeah, so I am actually planning to take a gap year and pursue a curatorial fellowship. And after that curatorial fellowship, my goal is to apply to graduate school and pursue a PhD in art history. But there's so much up in the air given COVID-19 and the state of everything. So we'll see, but that's the plan as of right now. And I'm really excited to kind of take the lessons and experiences I've had at Duke and explore new places, explore new things. So that is the plan as of now.
So this is Chandra Gwen, and I first have to just say how proud I am of you. So thank you so much for your work and for your walk through Duke and the way that you have done it. I have not been able to formulate a really great question, but I want, if you would, you to talk a bit about your thoughts around activism and how you see the opportunity for you to make a contribution in the art world. And I'm thinking here, of course, about the experience of you attending Patrice Culler's talk, and she talked about decolonizing the mind. I think we were at the reception, and a light bulb went on, and then I see you talk about liberated lives and leading liberated lives in the context of the exhibition. And I wonder if you just talk a little bit about how you see and think about activism in your pursuit of a career or further study in art history.
Sure. I feel like that is a good question. I think for me, in doing this project, I realized so many people dismiss scholarship as something that, you know, ends up in a textbook that you have to read or a book that no one reads. And I feel like that couldn't be farther from the truth. I think scholarship really has the ability to tangibly change people's lives. And I think I felt that this past summer in reading Patricia Hill Collins's Black Feminist Thought and realizing that, you know, a project can change the way that someone sees themselves, can change the way someone understands history or understands the role that they play in their environment. And I think that that's really the intention behind the projects that I hope to pursue moving forward. As we know, art history is like actively in the process of working to diversify the stories that we tell and the scholarship that's being able to be created. And I think that that is so important because just like reading the literature that I've talked about and seeing this exhibition from Denise Murrell completely opened my eyes to an intervention I can make in art history, as well as the way these images related to my own self. There's so much room for so many more questions to do the same. And I think that's where I see my kind of activist intervention is, you know, curating exhibitions and writing scholarship that really speaks to the way images have tangible consequences and influence on people's lives. And I think that this is what this project has been, kind of a practice in seeing how can I do that? What way can I ask questions? What way can I display research and create exhibitions that speak to people in that way? And then how can I come up with strategies and experiences that make that message accessible for people? So for example, before the museum was closed, right before we left for spring break, I, and along with a few of my classmates from my curatorial practicum class, hosted a curating workshop for the Nasher teens and used some of the objects that are in this exhibition and, you know, walk them through what the objects were, a little bit about who the Guerrilla Girls are, that sort of thing, and then gave it to them to curate. What narrative would you want to tell with these objects? What do they mean to you? And how would you display them? And they broke off into groups and they each created them themselves and came up with ideas and things I hadn't even thought about before. And I was like, that's a really great way of allowing students to kind of see how objects don't have to just be things in glass boxes or on white walls that you're not related to, but there are ways to think about objects and connect with objects that inform the way that you think about yourself or the world that you exist in. So that's the intervention that I'm hoping to make. Of course, aside from things like mentorship and giving and ways I'm able to. But I think activating scholarship and activating exhibitions for people and asking the kind of questions that show that artwork and scholarship has tangible consequences and tangible influence is the activist intention that I'm hoping to make in the art world, especially as it relates to Black stories and Black lives. So.
We have two questions in the chat that kind of go hand in hand. How has this project changed the way you see yourself? And could you share a little bit about your personal growth journey in this work and how your view and conception of yourself has shifted through this work of exploring representation and reclaiming, shaping our own narratives?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that the question began in New York. Because it was at the halfway point in my Duke career. I was making this transition to being an upperclassman, and it was a year of 2018, and about like every 6 weeks I was moving to a new city. So I did Duke and Venice over the summer, then I did an internship in Chicago. I had like a 3-day turnaround between Venice and Chicago, moved straight to Chicago for the rest of the summer, and then right after Chicago ended, I had a week at home and then moved to New York for a semester. And so a lot of movement, a lot of transitions, and in each place I was trying, because I was with new people in a new environment, I was trying to think about, you know, who am I in these places, in these contexts? One, you know, as a person in Venice for 6 weeks, no one looks like me. And then, you know, I go to Paris for a weekend and people start talking to me in French. And then, you know, you go to Chicago, and then I was working at an African American History Museum in Hyde Park. And so what does it mean for me to be in Hyde Park in Chicago, learning about Chicago's history and its museum, and then moving to New York, which is, you know, the hub of the art world, a place I had never been before. So trying to understand who I was in all these different contexts and feeling a lot of different influences, whether it be, you know, race in a global scale, going to Italy, you know, dealing with the political history of race in Chicago, and then, you know, being kind of thrust into the art world in New York and these questions about who I am and that sort of thing as it relates to the art world. There were just a lot of questions happening for me at the same time. And so I think it was a prime time for me to start. I'd been asking the questions through all the travels, and it was a prime time to start trying to move my way towards an answer. And I was actually in the Museum as Frame, which is one of the Duke of New York classes, where every week I went to a different museum. Like every Thursday, we had a 2-hour lecture in a gallery based off the reading and what was in the gallery at the time. And so between asking those questions through my travels and going to a museum every week, so many ideas were generating, and the art was influencing the questions that I was asking about myself, because I saw other people asking similar questions too. So I think it gave me the confidence to like proclaim that I wanted to ask this question, because I'd kind of been thinking about it a little bit in the back of my head, and then remember talking with my cohort in New York. I think I want to pursue this idea, and I did my own personal art project in relation to the idea, all of that. And so as I've gone through different stages of the research process, I've gone through different stages of my own personal process, learning what liberation means, learning, that there are whole scholars who have dedicated their career to providing us with the tools to not just succumb to history, but to understand history, let it inform our experiences, but not define our experiences, and define our sense of selves. Reading through that sort of work helped me completely transition the way that I thought about myself, my role to the world, my role in the world, that things didn't just happen to me, that I could do things, and that I could form my own opinions about things, and that, as Ms. Gwen talked about decolonizing the mind, there are lots of forces that are working to make us think a certain way, but I don't have to think that way, and I don't have to move that way. So I think that's how it's influenced my personal growth, is I think I have made it a commitment now to kind of live liberated, as I've said, which is an active thing, constant small choices that you have to make on a regular basis. But I feel more independent as a result, and more learned about just myself and as a woman as well. So